Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I'd like to welcome the folks in Ghana who have been listening. I tried to find some Halloween stories from your country, but I was unable to track down any. Lots of stories, just nothing Halloween related. If you like listening to the show and you'd like to show off your interests, check out my merchandise on tpublic.com. The T is spelled with two E's. T-E-E Public. You can purchase t-shirts, coffee cups, hoodies, all kinds of stuff. The extra income will help me put the show out and make it much more interesting experience, I hope. And you get some cool clothes. If you're a reader, check out some of my books at Amazon.com. The Laredo Paranormal Research Society, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, and Paranormal Laredo. Once again, the extra cash will help the show go on. Keep in mind, Christmas is coming up, and t-shirts and books make good Christmas presents. You can wrap them up, you can drop them on the floor, you can do all kinds of things to them. They don't break, they don't require batteries. Just thinking. I was talking about Poland's haunted locations last week, and I ran out of time before I ran out of stories. I had to skip Malaysia completely, so I'll pick up where I left off. No one can explain why so many horrifying things have been happening at one particular housing block in Ursianau district. From the outside, it looks like hundreds of other buildings all found all over Warsaw. There's no connection with the 1940s Warsaw ghetto, where thousands of Jews were held, many were murdered, all awaiting transport to a labor or death camp. The ghetto was farther north from this neighborhood. One of its inhabitants, at Fort Erbsta, threw herself off of her balcony. Her neighbor died in a car accident. Another neighbor murdered his wife. Even the mailman who delivered mail to the building killed himself. There are more cases of serious illness and higher suicide rate in this one building than any place in the rest of the city. Diviners, spiritists, paranormal investigators all visit the building trying to figure out what's causing so much tragic activity. One theory says the building's foundation holds the body of an evil man who's causing problems from the other side. The building started out as a workers' hotel, small utilitarian apartments for the men and women building Warsaw, mostly designed as temporary housing. Some folks think it's living in such small apartments that is causing the high suicide and murder rate. Well, I disagree. People live in much smaller places with no problems. There must be something from the past, a curse placed on the land, or maybe some unknown form of energy coming from below. I was surprised to see I have listeners in Malaysia. So here's a scary place you might not want to visit. If you have been there, let me know. Tell me what you saw. A Pudu prison, also called Pudu Jail, was built by the British in 1895 as a prison in Malaysia in the Kuala Lumpur area. It was used to house criminals or anyone the British thought might become a threat. Aside from holding prisoners, the place was also where questioning, better known as torture, was inflicted. Overseen by the British colonial government, convicts were forced to build the prison on what was once a Chinese burial ground. A few months after its completion, August 1895, a cholera outbreak struck the prison and killed a few hundred inmates. Later, it was found that the disease was caused by the prison's water supply system, which relied on an old well that ran through the Chinese cemetery, where all those bodies were still buried. An inspection by the British Colonial Authority revealed that the water in the well was severely contaminated by deadly viruses. The water problem wasn't addressed until 1898, 3 years later. The prison was home to both men and women. Some were locked up for years, while others with minor sentences were also locked up. You would have folks with minor violations mixed in with hardened criminals. The jail had its own garden where food was grown, sufficient to satisfy the needs of the prisoners. The cells in which the inmates were kept was claustrophobic, tiny little structures. They had a window the size of a shoebox. The door was made out of metal, and the prison was considered escape-proof, as well as very nasty. During World War II, after the fall of Singapore, the Japanese occupation forces incarcerated many English, Australian, and New Zealand prisoners there. Japanese POW camps were run on a different line than what was applied to European nations. At Kuala Lumpur, officers and men were kept together under the most degrading and horrific conditions. The senior prison officer, as well as his staff, were locals working for the Japanese. This was a benefit to their overlords since it reduced the numbers of soldiers needed for guard duty. In 1986, the Pudu prison siege, led by Jimmy Chua, took place. In this incident, a group of prisoners seized and held 2 members of the prison staff as hostages over a period of 6 days. Fortunately, the siege ended without any bloodshed when it was countered by the Malaysian Police Counterterrorism Group. Jimmy Chua and his fellow inmates were tried and sentenced to hang. They were executed October 10, 1989. The prison remained in operation until 1996. After more than 100 years, this place was closed and the remaining inmates were relocated to other prisons. Just about as soon as the building was closed, people began sneaking in to have a look. They would hear voices coming from parts of the building. A quick check would show there was nobody there. The sounds of cell doors slamming shut was a constant occurrence. Several people have reported seeing shadowy shapes moving around that would vanish as soon as they were seen. Over the years, the buildings slowly began to collapse due to neglect. Little remains of the prison today. I have listeners in Russia. If I were to say inconceivable, would you get the reference? As big as the country is, I would hope a few more would listen in. Of course, most folks in Russia don't speak English. If you are in Russia and listening to the show, these next few stories are from your country. Metro 2 is a legend that the Soviet Union constructed a secret metro system underneath Moscow. Its construction was ordered by Joseph Stalin, and it is said to connect directly from the Kremlin to out into the country. In the event of World War III, all the folks in the government could run away to the countryside, leaving the citizens there to absorb all that nasty radiation. Metro 2 was buried under the ground underneath the regular subway. The tunnels were built using slave labor from gulags. They started digging miles outside of Moscow, and as they worked under the city, some of them ran into creatures. These might have been weird experiments from former being performed in secret labs under Soviet supervision. Others believe there were things that had lived underground for thousands of years, never seeing humans until the tunnel came through. Even today, some will argue against there being a secret subway. Urban explorers have found their way into some deep subway tunnels that just might be the Stalin Line. There were also several defectors from the Soviet Union who swore it was real. They say it was still being used by the Russian government for secret operations as late as the 1990s. Somewhere around 500 years ago, the old woman of Ostankino first appeared. She appeared to the first ruler of Ostankino, Boyar Satin, and forbade him from tilling the land because it would upset the dead buried there. Instead of listening to her, she was chased away. The boyar instructed the people to get busy turning the land into farms. Soon after his orders were placed, the boyar was involved in a nasty scandal and he wound up losing his head. Literally. The old woman of Ostankino also appeared to Tsar Paul during his 4th year on the throne. She said he wouldn't live past spring, and he died that year. Alexander II also met the old woman. She said he was going to die at the hands of an infidel. Again, she was right. Alexander II was killed by a member of the Narodnaya Volya, a leftist party. If I'm not pronouncing these names correctly, keep in mind I have a hard enough time with English. Before the tower was built, the old woman of Ostankino was seen as she proclaimed the area would smell of blood. As she said, it was wrong to build on top of a graveyard. In 1993, amid skyrocketing prices and record unemployment, a vicious political fight between President Yeltsin and the Russian Congress led to the Congress impeaching him and replacing him. Well, Yeltsin refused to step down as riots began to break out all over the country. The rioters tried to take over the TV station. Yeltsin sent in the military and lots of people were killed or injured. If you hear that weird noise in the background, I have 2 kittens that were given to me by 2 groups of 3 girls each, which is kind of weird because I don't like coincidences. 3 girls came by the house, gave me a kitten and left, and then a couple of weeks later, 3 more girls, different girls, came by the house and gave me another kitten. So I kind of have a lot of cats running around right now. In 2000, the old woman was spotted before the TV tower caught fire. 4 people were killed in the fire. Whoever this old woman is, she is seen just before violence strikes. You could say she is Russia's version of the Mothman, showing up just before disasters. Running into the Moscow River, Golosov Ravine cuts Kolomenskoye Park in half. It was once a royal estate that was turned into a public wilderness covering an area bigger than Central Park in New York. Kolomenskoye Park is a nice place to visit, to take a stroll or enjoy a bit of nature. Golosov Ravine is not quite so nice. The earliest tale of mystery regarding Golosov Ravine dates back to 1621, when a Tartar cavalry detachment turned up at the walls of the Tsar's palace. They were lost and disoriented. They said they were part of the army of the Crimean Khan that had attacked Moscow in 1571. During the battle, the unit had ridden into the ravine to avoid capture. The ravine was enveloped in a thick greenish fog that helped hide the soldiers from the pursuing army. The cavalry unit had stayed in the ravine just long enough for the enemy to move on. After about 30 minutes, they rode back out looking for their own lines to rejoin. The soldiers were confused by how the battlefield had suddenly changed. Looking in every direction, they couldn't see the enemy or their own units. They slowly rode around looking for any sign of where everyone had gone. When they finally saw the walls of the Tsar's palace, they approached hoping to at least find out what was going on. The Tsar's men looked at the soldiers and their equipment. All of their weapons were out of date. The uniforms looked like something out of the past. It turned out the cavalry unit had somehow traveled 50 years into the future. There's no record of what happened to the soldiers once they discovered they were no longer in their own time. In the 19th century, 2 local men had a big night out at a neighboring village, drinking and fooling around with some of the ladies of negotiable affections. Once the night was at an end and most of their money was gone, the 2 decided to take a shortcut home. The shortcut went through the Golosov Ravine. They walked into the ravine in the dark. A fog enveloped them. Not wanting a broken leg or other injuries, the men took their time getting on to the other side. As they were walking, they discovered they were going in the wrong direction. There were too many trails and no way of knowing which was the right one. A dark shape came into sight. The creature was huge and covered in thick hair. At first, the men were terrified, but the creature didn't attack. Once they realized they were not about to be killed and eaten, the men looked the creature over. It looked them over as well. As if knowing the men were lost, the creature used hand and arm signals to point them in the right direction. Thankful to still be alive, the men followed the trail and managed to find their way out of the ravine. Making their way home, the men were shocked when their own wives didn't recognize them, and they didn't recognize their wives. To make matters worse, their children were all now adults. These men had been missing for over 20 years. The authorities were contacted, and as the police were conducting their investigation, one of the two men faded away, becoming a greenish fog that just blew away with the wind. There's no report as to what happened to the other man. The hairy creature seen by the two men was probably a lichai, a Slavic forest spirit. The lichai enjoy playing tricks on people, though when angered they can become treacherous. They are seldom seen, but their voices can be heard in the forest, laughing, whistling, or singing. In 1926, a policeman reported seeing a hairy wild man over 2 meters tall in the Golosov ravine. The resulting investigation into the sighting led to a Moscow newspaper story saying that a band of young pioneers, like Soviet Boy Scouts, had captured a lichai. The Golosov ravine was once the site of a shrine to Veles, the Slavic trickster god of earth, water, woods, magic, and the underworld. This adds to the story of unknown spirits or cryptids living in the ravine. A Golosov ravine is the site of several springs considered sacred in Russian Orthodox, neo-pagan, and New Age traditions, and contains a neo-pagan sacred stone shrine consisting of 2 5-ton rocks called divai, female energy, and goose, male energy. Visitors to the Golosov ravine have developed an attraction to these shrines. They visit and show the respect by leaving small gifts. The USSR and the United States were not only enemies at one time, but they were also trying to outdo each other in everything. As something to keep in mind, the people of Russia and the people of the United States didn't hate each other. It was the folks in Washington and Moscow that used their positions to become immensely wealthy, stirring up things between our two countries. Scientists wanted to see who could drill a hole deep into the earth. They wanted to know what was down there. The American project, Project Mohill, stationed off the Pacific coast of Mexico, was cut short in 1966 due to a lack of funds. The folks with the money wanted to get to the moon first and not the center of the earth. The Soviet borehole project was started drilling at the Kola Peninsula from 1970, and they kept going until 1994. Drilling deep into the earth is a lot harder than you might think. The deeper you get, the longer the drill pipe gets, which makes it that much heavier. The power plant has to put out enough energy to lift and turn a huge amount of weight. As the drill passes through dirt and rock, it twists and turns and has to be constantly redirected. The deeper they went, the hotter things got. Every time the drill bit needed to be replaced or the drill pipe broke, the entire length would have to be pulled up piece by piece, replaced, and then put back down the same hole. As the pipe was pulled, the hole would sometimes collapse in on itself. On occasion, the scientists would lower equipment into the hole to grab samples or get readings of the layers of rock. A few times, they lowered recording devices into the hole. The heat would melt just about everything, so they had to work quickly. Temperatures as high as 356 degrees were being found in the 1990s. These temperatures kept going up, too. The guy in charge lowered a microphone into the hole. They recorded sounds from deep under our feet. The sounds they heard were screams and moans as if people were being tortured. Hearing these sounds, the scientists believed they had drilled into hell. I first heard these sounds on Coast to Coast back when Art Bell was running things. You can still find the show by searching Art Bell Sounds from Hell. If it doesn't give you the creeps, I don't know what will. Another report says a small, weird-looking creature had popped out of the hole and flown away. A 40,000-foot deep hole would be 7.5 miles. If you were to fall into the hole, it would take 3.5 to 4 minutes before you hit the bottom. The folks talking about the hole say once the recording was heard in Moscow, the project was shut down. The atheistic folks in Moscow didn't want any kind of proof of there being anything not explainable by science or evolution. If God didn't exist, then there was no hell. If they had a recording from hell, then God must exist as well. Most politicians pray there is no hell because they're afraid they're going to have an express one-way ticket there the day they die. This Kola super deep borehole can still be visited today. It's hidden underneath a rusty lid. The building is falling down and there's not much else to look at. Maybe if you put your ear right down next to the lid, you might just hear something. Portugal has joined my listening audience. Not far from the city center of Aguida, Quinta de Palicia sits in the middle of a large unkept plot of land surrounded by a wrought iron fence. It is the classic image of what a Hollywood haunted house should look like. It was inhabited by the Aguadenis family who had moved to Brazil in the late 1800s but returned in the early 1900s, naming the home after the city of Sao Paulo. Much of the family succumbed to the influenza pandemic of the 1918, with the exception of Nika Carneiro, who was a patron of the community sports and cultural programs, but he died childless at the age of 37. The home has sat vacant ever since due to legal constraints with the family back in Brazil. Some visitors have heard neighing of horses where the stables once stood. Others have been frightened by the sounds of gunshot blast or a gentle pulling on the hair. You choose which is worse, having your hair pulled or hearing somebody firing a gun at you. A worker in the garden suddenly experienced such an intense headache that he had to leave and he refuses to ever return. A Sanatorio de Valengo is in Portugal as well. Victims of tuberculosis epidemic were said to haunt the sanitarium. Built in 1910 to house 50 patients, the disease quickly spread and the number of patients increased to 150, and then there were 500. There was no cure for what became known as the White Plague, and all of the patients died. With the discovery of antibiotics, the disease was eventually under control. The sanitarium closed in 1961. If you visit today, you will see pentagram designs that are built into the walls. Were they meant to bring blessings or invite in spirits? Today, the sanitarium is used as a battleground for paintball enthusiasts. And yes, on occasion they say they see and hear things that can't be explained. The Sanatorio de Serra de Estrella near Covilhã was built by Portugal's railway department in 1936. Their main focus was treatment, well, holding tuberculosis patients. Once you checked in, you were there for life. The building was later leased to the Portuguese Society of Sanitariums on condition of receiving any and all railroad patients needing treatment. It was closed in the 1980s and left to deteriorate. The sanatorio was refurbished and transformed into a luxurious new Posada Serra de Estrella. The building is haunted by its many former patients. Many unexplained sightings have been reported by both staff and guests. All of the usual things. People being seen walking down a hallway that suddenly vanish. Footsteps being heard where there's nobody to make them, and things that move around by themselves. The village of São Pedro de Cova was largely an agricultural community until the discovery of coal in 1802. The exhausting and dangerous industry of mining soon took over. Several generations of miners worked there until low oil prices forced the mine to shut down in the 1970s. All that's left of the mines are the ruins and the tailings. How many people died while digging in the earth is unknown. The records are long gone. People living in the area say spirits of the miners protect the ruins and the mine shafts. They see shadowy beings moving about the buildings as well as the openings to the mines. Some folks say they hear screaming from the deep holes. The sounds of digging can be heard coming from the long, dormant shafts. Legend has it that a huge mansion was built in the Guarda district in Portugal by a Spanish Count Don Rodrigo after learning that the natural healing waters could cure his daughter's skin disease. I don't know what was wrong with her, but it needed fixing. Could it have been acne, maybe? News of the waters quickly spread, and in 1920s, the site became a restorative spa known as the Hotel Serra de Peña. The waters were actually radioactive, seeping from a uranium mine not far away. Radioactivity was all the rage in the 20s and 30s, so the site bottled the spring water and sold it under the name radium water. Once radioactive was studied further in the 40s, it became apparent that the healing qualities of the radium water actually carried this opposite effect. The hotel went out of business in the 50s and has been abandoned ever since. People visiting the abandoned hotel have seen people walking around that will suddenly vanish. They also hear doors slamming, footsteps on the upper floors, and whispered conversations. It is said the site is haunted by the many people who drank from the contaminated spring. Quinta de Juncasa was built in Portugal as a huge farmhouse. The owner was Baron Lagas. He lived there with his family until his jealousy got the better of him. The Baron began to suspect his wife was running around on him. Being a somewhat violent guy to begin with, hearing about his wife's infidelity drove him into a rage. He tied his wife up and drug her behind a horse around his property until she was dead. Once the deed was done, the Baron discovered he was mistaken. His wife had not been unfaithful, and he had allowed his imagination to cause him to murder his wife. Sinking into a deep depression, the Baron killed all of his children and then himself. People visiting the falling down farm today have seen both the Baron and his wife, as shadowy figures that vanish as soon as you look directly at them. There's a house in Ovar that no one is willing to live in. People who have decided to give the place a try have moved in, either moved out immediately, either the next day, or even in the middle of the night. Some have left all of their possessions behind. The story goes a man built the house to live in along with his young daughter. He was quite strict, and he didn't want her misbehaving in any way. One day, he discovered she was seeing a boy from town. In a fit of rage, he threw the young couple into a well situated in the basement of the house. He left them there to die. People who try to live in the house are driven away by the two ghosts from the well. It is believed the young couple are trying to protect the house from anybody to keep it for themselves. Let's move on to Italy. Yes, there's somebody listening in Italy as well. Poveglia is a tiny Italian island located in the South Lagoon between Lido and Venice. Poveglia Island is a small dot of a land in the Venice Lagoon off the eastern coast of northern Italy. At times it was used as a safe haven, a military checkpoint, and an institution for people with mental illness. It is best known for its macabre use during the bubonic plague epidemic, when victims were quarantined and burned on the grounds. The little island was first mentioned in print in the early 15th century as a safe haven from invasions by Alaric the Goth and Attila the Hun during the decline of the Roman Empire. Around 864 AD, the governor, or doge, was killed, and 200 of his slaves fled to the island to live out their lives as free people. During the Chioggia War, with Genoa that began in 1379, officials forced the residents of Poveglia Island to move to a different island in the Venetian lagoon. They built an octagonal fort and turned Poveglia into a fort to control the lagoon. In the 1500s, monks used the island briefly as a monastery. As the Black Plague ravaged all of Europe, those suspected of having the disease were shipped to the island to live and die away from the rest of society. The island was home to unknown thousands from 1576 until 1630. As people died in Venice from the plague, their bodies would be dumped into pits along with everyone else. As the pits filled up, the dead were loaded onto boats and transported to Poveglia Island and dumped. There was no one counting the bodies. If you can picture a boat loaded to the gunwales with dead, sailing across the waves to be unloaded onto the island, those doing the hauling were also in risk of becoming sick and dying. In the early 1400s, the Venetians invented the concept of lazaretto. This is an institution or a hospital designed for quarantine of ill or potentially ill people. Lazaretto Vecchio, a small island in the lagoon, was home to the first lazaretto. During an excavation on the island, archaeologists unearthed more than 1,500 plague victims who were buried in pits. The scientists believe there are still thousands more buried there. Overcrowding became a real issue as hundreds of people were being sent to recover or die. The sick lay 3 or 4 people to a bed. Workers collected the dead and threw them into graves all day without a break. People who looked near death or were too weak to say anything would be hauled to the pit and dumped. You know that scene in The Holy Grail? I'm not dead yet. One of those kind of situations. Poveglia served as a quarantine for the sick and a dumping ground for masses of corpses. At times, barges were necessary to ship the bodies. Anyone stricken with even mild symptoms was quickly removed from their families and societies, and they were taken to the island. Once there, they spent up to 40 days in quarantine, where they either died or recovered, which didn't happen very often. Authorities began incinerating thousands of bodies on Poveglia Island to prevent further spread of the disease. In 1777, the Magistrate of Health took control of the island and turned it into a checkpoint. Any boat or ship heading into Venice needed to pass preventative measures against disease. In the 1790s, 2 ships failed and officials found cases of plague on board. As a result, Poveglia Island became once again a quarantine colony for roughly 10 years until the early 1800s, when the hospital shut down. In the early 20th century, the government repurposed the island, building housing for the mentally ill. As time went on, sinister stories about the treatment and the experimentation on the patients began to filter to the outside world. The doctor in charge of the island was using his collection of patients who couldn't say no to perform all manner of inhumane treatments. He would experiment on them to see just about anything you can imagine was doable. The doctor conducting these experiments slowly began to lose control of the patients. Eventually, they escaped from their confinement and they went looking for justice. The doctor was chased into a tower where he was cornered, killed, and bricked up inside one of the walls. Some say he was simply bricked up, allowed to die on his own time. The patients and staff finally abandoned the island in 1968. It has remained unoccupied to this day, except for a population of tormented ghosts. The remaining buildings, a hospital, church, and a shelter for boats, are crumbling away with time. The ghosts of the plague were seen by those sent to the island as mental patients. When they died, their ghosts joined in to haunt the island. There are many stories about the ghost sightings reported from Poveglia Island. The island has witnessed many unfortunate deaths. Many say that they still hear moans and cries coming from the island. If you stand still and listen, you'll hear people coughing around you. These would be the plague victims. They still roam the island today. Some say there are some violent ghosts in some of the buildings. These spirits like to touch people. They'll push, hit, or even choke you. Many say that there are some visitors who were scared to death on the island. A family visited the island with the ideas of building a holiday home there for themselves, but they left during the first night. They didn't say why they left, but it is said that their daughter was attacked by some unseen force and she wound up needing 14 stitches. Based on eyewitness reports, the most common anomalies okay, I'm making up a new word. The most common anomalies at Poveglia are disembodied wailing, muffled screams, moans as if from pain, apparitions of women, men of all ages, nasty smells that come and go with no apparent source. People hear phantom footsteps inside the buildings, especially in the former asylum. Doors will open and close on their own. One of the longest continually inhabited castles in Ireland, Leap Castle, has a rich and fascinating history. Leap Castle is thought to have been built in the early 1500s by the O'Banion clan. Before the castle was built, the location was used by the Druids. The castle has been home to a lot of bloodshed and violence over the centuries. Originally named Liam O'Banion, meaning Leap of the O'Banions, legend has it that two O'Banion brothers were contesting the chieftainship of their clan. The only way to settle this argument was to display their strength and bravery. They were to both jump off a rocky outcrop where the castle was to be built. The survivor won the honor and the right to be chieftain. Leap Castle was used as a principal stronghold of the O'Carroll clan. It was used to guard the pass through the Sliev Bloom Mountains and has been said that no castle has more well fortified than Leap. The O'Carrolls called Leap Castle their home until 1642, when an English soldier under Cromwell named John Darby took possession. The castle has been subject to a lot of remodeling and restoration over the years. Most of the remodeling was done by the Darbys. In 1922, the castle was attacked and burned. The walls were stone, but the interior was wood. A Leap Castle has been built, burned, torn up, rebuilt, stolen, rebuilt some more, all over the years. People have been born there, died, murdered, executed, or left to die over the centuries as well. Some of the first written records of ghosts in the castle came from Mildred Darby. Telling of noises like furniture being moved were frequently heard at night, and strangers who were staying with them would often ask why the servants turned out rooms underneath them at such an unusual hour. The front doorbell would sometimes ring, but when they went to answer it, there would be no one there. Another owner, Sean Ryan, heard chanting coming from outside the castle. He often would hear somebody calling his name. Peter Gerard owned the castle for a few years before Peter Bartlett. His mother had been a friend of Cicely O'Connell Darby and had been invited to spend the night at the castle before a dance. She said she didn't sleep well because throughout the entire night, she felt as if someone or something was standing at the foot of the bed. Both Sean Ryan and the previous owner before him, Peter Bartlett, have experienced bizarre poltergeist activity during their restoration efforts. Peter Bartlett was not specific, but he did mention to a friend the incredible amount of poltergeist activity that occurred during his time spent undergoing the restorations. Sean Ryan spoke about his tools getting moved to the far corner of the house any time his back was turned. A carpenter employed by Sean left suddenly and refused to come back, never saying why he wouldn't. Sean's restoration efforts were suddenly stopped when the ladder he was working on was pushed away from the wall, forcing him to jump several stories, fracturing his knee. Upon resuming work, another accident resulted in a broken ankle. Ghosts are one thing, people who once lived and are still hanging around. Elementals are spirits that were never living people, things from some other world or dimension. There seems to be an elemental that is considered one of the most interesting spirits that resides at Leap Castle. It is an entity that is shrouded in mystery and intrigue. The first encounter, origin, and exact nature of the elemental is unknown, but there are many theories that have circulated over the years. The time of its appearance is not certain, but there have been vague mentions of a troublesome spirit at Leap Castle since the very early days. One belief is that the elemental was put there by the Druids long before the castle was built to protect the sacred site used for magic. Another theory is that the elemental was placed there by an invading force, with instructions to burn the castle from the inside. The person responsible is thought to have been Gerald Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare. He was a renowned magic practitioner and had attempted to overthrow the castle on several occasions. Fitzgerald, well, my family name on my grandmother's side includes Fitzgerald. I have cousins today that go by that name. I wonder if there's any relation to that guy in Ireland. Local myths say that the elemental is the spirit of an ancient O'Carroll who died in the castle from leprosy. This is said to be the reason for the decomposing facial features and the appalling smell that accompanies the presence of the spirit. If this were true, then it wouldn't be an elemental, but some other kind of spirit. Mildred Darby was said to have dabbled in the occult. Her activities focused on seances and automatic writing. Some think that it was her dabbling that either awoke or summoned the elemental. It was around this time that the horrific discovery of the oubliette, 3 carloads of bones, approximately 150 bodies, were made. The huge release of emotional energy linked to the spirits in the oubliette upon their discovery may have been enough to wake up the dormant spirit. It was shortly after this that Mildred Darby would have her terrifying encounter with the elemental. An oubliette is also known as the Forgotten. It was a small room, a dungeon, built into a castle where prisoners were dumped and forgotten. There was no way to get in or out. Only a trap door so the victim would drop high enough to break a leg, if not both. Sometimes a spike would be set into the floor so the person falling would become impaled. Whatever this entity is, it only seemed to make its presence known when people began to provoke it. The current owners, the Ryans, have lived in Leap since 1991, and they say they've never encountered the elemental. Mildred Darby might have been provoking the creature with her occult dabblings. There are few personal accounts of the encounter with the elemental, so an accurate description is quite hard to formulate. The best descriptions we have were given by Mildred. She said, "Suddenly 2 hands were laid on my shoulders. I turned around sharply and saw, as clearly as I see you now, a gray thing standing a couple of feet from me. Its bent arms raised as if it were cursing me. I cannot describe in words how utterly awful the thing was. It was undefinable, rendering the horrible shadow more gruesome. Human in shape, a little shorter than I could just make out the shape of big black holes like great eyes and sharp features. But the whole figure, head, face, hands, and all, were gray, unclean, bluish gray, something of the color and appearance of common cotton wool, but oh so sinister, repulsive, and devilish. My friends who are clever about occult things say it is what they call an elemental. The thing was about the size of a sheep, thin, gaunt, shadowy in parts. Its face was kind of human, or to be more accurate, inhuman. It had large holes where the eyes should have been, loose, slobbery lips. They had saliva dripping from its jaws. The nose, well, there was no nose, only a hole where the nose should have been. Everything was the color of gray, kind of a bluish gray. Its forearms were thickly coated with hair, as was its legs. In another account of running into the elemental, June 2006, the man said, I looked into the darkness of the corridor that exited the spiral stairway. I became aware of the smell of sulfur. It was as if a box and several boxes of matches had all been lit at once. I looked at my friend who had taken me to visit Leap Castle. He could also smell the sulfur. I stared into the darkness of the corridor and had the impression that a beast, like a bear or a lion, was staring back at me. The tension was rising like a thickening time bomb. My friend then closed the door and said, Let sleeping dogs lie, meaning sometimes you just have to leave things alone. He was a friend of Sean Ryan, and I certainly did not want to disrespect either of them by stirring up the elemental. The Swiss are embracing Halloween with great glee. Because Halloween isn't a Swiss tradition, it doesn't mean that there aren't things that go bump in the night over there. The story of the Joller House, which stood up in the 2010, which stood until 2010 in Stance when it was torn down because nobody was brave enough to live there. The house belonged to Melcher Joller, who moved in 1840 along with his family of 5 children. Shortly after moving in, things began to get scary. Melcher wrote in a journal where he recounts the paranormal activity. Stones were thrown around the house. Furniture was shoved around, and it sounded as if somebody was beating on the walls with a hammer. This would go on day and night. Food would be thrown across the kitchen. Windows would open and slam shut on their own. His son saw a ghost at 8 o'clock in the morning and fainted. Mr. Joller felt that he had had enough, and he sought help by traveling to Rome to consult with the Pope. After 5 years of nonstop activity, Mr. Joller passed away at the age of 47. Who could the vengeful ghost have been that drove this lawyer to his death? None other than his own grandmother, Veronica Gutt. She had been a fierce, rich farmer who believed that Switzerland should be free from any foreign power, and she was the head of the armed resistance in the late 1700s. She'd had a tragic life, losing her son in a battle against the French, and 4 of her daughters drowned while fleeing from Napoleon's soldiers. With so much tragedy in her life, Veronica couldn't stand the thought of anyone being happy. Much to her horror, her grandson Melcher grew up to become a liberal who was open to trading with France. This was something she could never forgive him for. Some say she actually died just so she could haunt him. In any case, she managed to drive him to his death, and the house remained haunted until it was torn down in 2010. People say that her restless, homeless spirit still haunts the area, and no new structure is ever planned to replace the old house. The Belgian Tunnel in Switzerland is part of the A2 motorway from Basel to Chiasso. The ghost of an old lady is known to haunt this road. It's one of the top haunted roads in the world. The tunnel was opened in 1996. It's 10,430 feet long. One report says 2 women picked up an old lady as they were driving towards the tunnel. The old woman warned them that something bad was going to happen, and then she disappeared right in the middle of the tunnel. The 2 women were startled by the sudden disappearance. They drove carefully out of the tunnel, and nothing bad happened. Perhaps it's because they were heeding her warning. Other people report seeing an old lady dressed all in white hitchhiking on the approach to the tunnel. If they stop and offer her a ride, she will vanish from the back seat while the car is still inside the tunnel. Sometimes she will warn of impending doom, or sometimes she'll just sit in the back seat. I hope I made your Halloween a little bit more interesting. If you'd like to contact me, perhaps you have a story you'd like to see in my next book, or you've got a subject you'd like to hear me talking about on the show, you can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Also, if you'd like to buy some presents, you can check that site, TeePublic, and maybe buy a t-shirt or 2. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?